You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You're listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Michael Seth Starr. He's covered television as a reporter and columnist at the New York Post since 1995. He has written several books, including a filmography of Peter Sellers, and biographies of Art Carney, Joey Bishop, Bobby Darin, Raymond Burr, absolutely sinister in Rear Window. Red Fox, probably in the top 5 of the funniest people who ever lived. Ringo Starr, William Shatner, and now Don Rickles. His new book is called Don Rickles, The Merchant of Venom. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Robert. This is great. Thanks for having me on.
When I pick up the Red Fox book or the Ringo Starr book, if you do have fun today, can we have you back on?
Of course. Always happy to talk about all those guys.
Well, we were talking for a few minutes before we started the recording, how you and I basically grew up in the same time period. I was born in 1967, and Don Rickles was such a huge part of the public television and sort of popular culture landscape. What were your first memories of him? And did he make you laugh? Because I know he made your parents laugh.
Yeah. Yes, my parents saw Don in Las Vegas in the 60s, actually, probably at the Sahara Hotel. My first memories of Don are from the Dean Martin celebrity roasts when he would come on and do his thing. He was always the last one to perform because, let's face it, nobody could top Don Rickles. And he was actually the only performer on those roasts whose lines were not written for him. Everybody else had writers and, because they'd have all different sorts of entertainers on, astronauts and
Neil Armstrong, Wilt Chamberlain. Yeah.
People you wouldn't expect. So they all have, but nobody wrote for Don. He came up with his own stuff. And and he was part of his brilliance was his off the cuff, sort of like machine gun style riffing on different people, which was perfect for the roasts. And then, of course, watching him on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, those were just classics. You mentioned before, Robert, when we were talking about watching those clips on YouTube. There were a lot of those and more about Don, and people can check out just to see how quick on his feet he was and how much fun he was, particularly on a talk show.
Well, that was actually one of the first questions I wanted to ask you, because the one thing that I see in all of his clips, or at least 99% of them, is that Don Rickles could take it. I mean, he got made fun of a lot. Carson really took it to him on more than one occasion, and Rickles reveled in it. He enjoyed the give and take. So it wasn't like he just dished it out and couldn't take it. It was both. He's like, I insult. Now give me your best shot, Johnny.
Right. And one of the particular manifestations of people making fun of Don was his lack of sitcom success. He tried and tried again, never really had a very successful sitcom. That was always the basis of Rickles, you can't even get or launch a successful sitcom. That kind of thing. But yes, he did give as good as he took, or took as good as he gave in this case. And I think that's why he was such a good talk show host. He was willing to be made fun of, and obviously willing to make fun of the host and the people sitting on the couch next to him, whether it was Ed McMahon or Michael Landon or Pat Boone or whoever happened, or Angie Dickinson, whoever happened to be there was fair game. And they knew that, of course. And that was Don's bread and butter.
It was funny. I remember, and it's on YouTube, one particular clip. He's on the Tonight Show with Johnny. It looks like it's early 80s, maybe late 70s, early 80s. You can only tell by the clothes and the upholstery what year it was. But I think Don says something to Johnny like, how long are you going to hang on, right? You're just going to do this show till you die? And Carson, without missing a beat, looks at him and says, well, I like to do one show, for my whole life, as opposed to you who just keeps trying more and more. You're trying to do 3 or 4, like right to your point, like stuck him right where it counted. And Rickles laughed pretty hard.
Right.
So he could take it.
He could take it. And to me, some of those best Tonight Show moments are when Don either was already on the show, or he occasionally just walked in unannounced. He had that. He was allowed to do that. Bob Hope was allowed to do the same thing. There were certain people who could just, walk on the Tonight Show. And when Frank Sinatra was there, those were always great shows, because Don would just, it was always along the same lines, but he would always rip on him. And Sinatra took it, and he took it in good humor, which was not an easy thing to do with Frank Sinatra. I think
we're gonna get to that. Yeah. Was it Mangananzo?
Mangananzo got hurt. I called him in Jersey City. Boom! All over the highway. Yeah. He would always hone in on that with Sinatra, and we can talk about that, which is pretty much how Don really got his start.
Exactly. It comes through in your book. We're talking with Michael Seth Starr about his book, Don Rickles, The Merchant of Venom. Mr. Starr has made frequent appearances on television, including The Today Show, Access Hollywood, Good Morning America, Larry King Live, Extra, Inside Edition, Entertainment Tonight, and Indiana University's own Tavis Smiley. Way to go, Tavis. Let's talk a little bit. The thing that came out when I read your book, it was all kind of like, okay, I've heard this. But then when I got to the point, and I don't want to skip over his early life, that he attended the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and had some very famous classmates, either in his class or a year or two before or after. Why does Don Rickles not get that sort of reaction? In other words, the reaction I got when I read that, because he doesn't come across as an actor. And what drove him to want to be in show business for a career?
Right. Well, I don't think he gets that reaction because people, first of all, probably don't know that part of him. But he is so unforgettable as the Merchant of Venom and Mr. Warmth and his
poster boy for Planned Parenthood.
Yeah,
according to Carson.
Yeah, right. But he's so indelible as an insult comic that part of his career, and let's face it, I mean, he was not a very successful dramatic actor. He did later he did get notices for in some dramatic movies, including The Rat Race with Debbie Reynolds and Tony Curtis, and later on in his career, Casino. He was in Run Silent, Run Deep with Clark Gable, but he's just so over the top with his on-stage career that, yes, people don't realize, I think many people don't realize that he really did want to be a dramatic actor. He did not start out to be a comedian at all, a stand-up comedian of any stripe, let alone an insult comic. He really wanted to be a dramatic actor. And as you mentioned, Robert, he after high school, he enlisted in the Navy. He was there for 2.5 years during World War II. And when he was discharged, he applied for membership in the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, which is located in Manhattan in New York City, and he was accepted. It's a 2-year program. He wanted to be a dramatic actor, even though he was he was a funny kid. He made all the guys when he was in the Navy, he made the guys on the ship laugh. He imitated a lot of them. He insulted a lot of them. But that really wasn't where he wanted to go with his career. I think he considered himself really a more in line with a serious actor as opposed to a comedian. And he put in 2 years, and he graduated, as you mentioned. Grace Kelly was a classmate, a year behind him, if memory serves, and Conrad Bain, who later went on to star in Maude and Different Strokes. Jason Robards Jr., distinguished actor, All the President's Men. Don Murray, who starred in Bus Stop with Marilyn Monroe, and there were several others. But Don, when he graduated, really tried at that time in the late 40s. Broadway in New York City was the main source of entertainment. Broadway and radio.
Right.
TV was still in its infancy. Milton Berle was just getting started, 1948, thereabouts, getting started. So really the main sources of entertainment were radio and drama. There was no television or movies, but if you're in New York City, unless you're going to fly out to LA and try that. So Don tried to break into legitimate theater in New York City. He auditioned for many shows, usually dramas, sometimes musicals, but he didn't have what it took. I mean, he might have gotten called back once or twice, but he never really made that final cut and was not hired. So I think he realized early on that he was going to have to shift his focus as far as entertainment was concerned. And he didn't quite get away from the drama. He started to perform in clubs, but he was more of sort of a performance artist. He would do these strange acts. Like he had one of his performances was called The Man with the Glass Head. It was borrowed from a Peter Lorre character where
I heard of that before.
You'd have to imagine Don. He would be a character on stage with a glass bowl over his head, and he would act out the thoughts that he was thinking. That's so the audience could see. And it was just weird. Did not go over well. What a surprise! He was not a big success with that. So he was at a club in Washington D.C., a strip club, because that's what he was trying to pay his dues, and he would basically work for whoever hired him.
And his family wasn't wealthy. I mean, they weren't destitute, but his family wasn't wealthy, to say.
They weren't wealthy. His mother was very ambitious for Don, Etta, and she was a big influence in his career. And she would actually travel with him sometimes. But so she was always pushing him. And he was at a strip club down by the docks in Washington, D.C., by the Navy Yard. And, and he started to get heckled in his act. And he just threw caution to the wind and started heckling back. He figured, what do I have to lose? And he found that he had a talent for doing that, and he had a talent for doing it without alienating his audience. I mean, that's not to say he would get into trouble occasionally by picking on the wrong person or somebody who didn't have a great sense of humor about it. But he discovered this talent, and that's how he started his quote unquote, his insult act. And he worked more and more of it into the act until he was just solely being booked to come on stage and make fun of people in the audience. He wasn't a joke teller. It wasn't a Henny Youngman, take my wife, please. Or, my wife is, he would work one-liners into the act, especially about his wife. But he started to just pick on people. And it didn't matter if they were tall, short, ethnicity was never a concern with Don. He picked on everybody. Hispanic people, Black people, Jewish people, Asians. It didn't matter to him, but he was funny, and people, for whatever psychological reason, enjoyed being made fun of by this guy on stage, and it started to pay off for him. He started to get booked into bigger and bigger clubs as word spread, and the rest, as they say, it's not so much immediate history, but within several years, he was hitting the big time.
Who were some of his contemporaries? You write about them in your book. Some got along with Don. Some did not find him funny, but I would say most of them did. But for those of us who are about the same age, reel off some of these names so we can kind of smile to ourselves.
Well, I would say Joey Bishop, Buddy Hackett. There was another insult comedian named Jack Leonard, who was called Fat Jack Leonard because he was fat. That's what they did back then. And I think Jack Leonard was probably considered Don's biggest rival in the insult comedy world. And Jack Leonard was not happy when Don started to really hit it big. And he would call him, my student, and he would claim that Don was ripping part of his act off. I don't think Don was, and I don't think Don thought he was either.
Mm-hmm.
Their acts, while they were both. Fat Jack was a little more intellectual in his put downs, and he was a little older than Don, so he'd been around a little longer. But you had, I mentioned Buddy Hackett,
Alan King,
Shecky Green, Milton Berle, who was Don's idol. And later on, Don went into business with Buddy Hackett in opening up a hotel in Lake Tahoe, I believe. It didn't do well, but listen, comics are very. If there's anything you can say about comics, is they're very competitive with each other, and I think Don was able to escape a lot of that because he wasn't a joke teller, and he was never really accused of ripping off anybody's jokes. That's a big thing with comics,
right?
He ripped off my jokes. He's doing my act, blah blah blah. And Don
was it Jack Benny? Who was the one who was always accused of stealing jokes? Like there was a running joke was that he did nothing but steal jokes.
Milton Berle.
Yeah.
He was called the thief of bad gags.
There's a great when a Dane Martin roast of Bob Hope. I don't know if you've seen that one. I'm sure you have, obviously, but Rickles makes a joke about all the old people on the dais to roast Bob Hope and says something to the effect, Milton Berle's here, so-and-so's here. It's great being at the home. And Milton Berle gets up and goes to, challenge Don, and then he goes to sit down and so on and so forth. The interplay is just so funny. I didn't know that Berle was his hero until I read your book.
Yeah. And I think Don he had a lot of respect for Milton Berle, a lot of respect the way he came up in the business. And when Don was starting out, as I mentioned before, in the late 40s, Berle had Texaco Star Theater came on in 48. And he was like the biggest celebrity in the country at that time in this new medium of television. And Don was just in awe of Milton Berle, and he would hang out at a drugstore that was located right near Berle's offices, so he could get a glimpse of the man walking in, in Midtown Manhattan, maybe say hello to him. But yeah, and they had a lifelong friendship and respect for each other. Berle was very gracious with Don once Don hit it big. As was Frank Sinatra.
And so I want to get to Frank next because that's obviously Rickles' big break. But some of Rickles' contemporaries, they just didn't get along for whatever reason, or they didn't appreciate or like, or think that Don's humor was art, the way, a joke teller per se would say, well, I'm an artist. I'm memorizing these and come up with these great lines and great jokes. Can you talk about a little bit for a minute, the friction between Don and some of his fellow comedians in like the 50s, early 60s?
Well, it's not the comedy world it's not a collegial world. There's not, there's intense rivalry, jealousy. One comic makes it big, and the other guy's like, I'm
funnier than he is. Why is he making?
He stole my act. He's using my lines. He got lucky. All that kind. It's like it is in any walk of life, right? Jealousy. Sometimes success can bring jealousy on your competitors' part, and I think that's especially true in the world of comedy. And in the 50s, when TV was starting to become the medium overtaking radio, and movie executives were petrified of television because they thought nobody would go to pay to see movies anymore. They'd get it for free on small screen. It turned out not to be true, but it did, I think, put a bite into Hollywood box office. But and comics would, they would be angry that why did so-and-so why did Fat Jack Leonard get a shot on Ed Sullivan? I auditioned, I'm just as good as he is. And TV was such a way to make somebody's name that if you got a shot on Sullivan or Perry Como show, Red Skelton, any of those big shows, your career was, at least for the immediate future, was made, because then you get booked into clubs, as seen on the Ed Sullivan show, as seen on Perry Como, and it was a big help. Don, unfortunately, couldn't couldn't overcome that hurdle in the mid 50s. Couldn't get on Sullivan, and he couldn't get on any of the big shows until the end of the decade, when he really started to make his mark.
Who did Don Rickles, not just in this time period, obviously, but throughout his life, who did Don Rickles think was funny? I can picture him laughing up, and I could be 100% wrong, but I can picture him laughing uproariously at some of the things Rodney Dangerfield would say.
Yeah. Well, Don, as we mentioned, Milton Berle, Don really never spoke that much about, notwithstanding Berle, about who he thought was funny. He liked a lot of the up and coming guys in the 80s and 70s and 80s, like Jay Leno. He was a big fan of Leno's, and Jerry Seinfeld. But in the 60s, it's a good question, and I don't know if I can really answer that. He was liked. He was pretty much liked by everybody in the business, but he never really talked that much about who he thought was very funny. And maybe that was a good thing, sort of to remain neutral, and just laugh at everybody's jokes. If you watch him on those roasts with Dean Martin roasts, or even on the Tonight Show, he's cracking up at everything, and probably didn't think everything was that funny, but he was being diplomatic about it.
How fortunate was Rickles to come up or get his breakthrough in what a lot of people consider the golden age of television? That 50s, 60s, maybe even early 70s, where, as you said, television really took over. Obviously, Rickles had a ton of success at the casinos and in theater, those sorts of things, live performances. But most people I know, even I do, when I look back at some of the clips from 50, 60 years ago, just think that's a marvelous time in American popular culture.
Yes, it was. And it's a good point, Robert. TV was at its peak then. And, they call it peak TV now, but you know what I mean? It was considered the golden age, especially in the 50s. And even when Don, in the late 50s, early 60s, Johnny Carson started, Jack Paar was already big. Don was on the Paar show. And then, of course, when Johnny took over from Jack Paar, he just took it up 3 notches, and he was the king of late night. To get a shot on Carson you could make your career or break your career if you were no good. Carson loved Don from the get-go, from the first time he was on, and I think it was 1964, if memory serves, 63, 64, 65. Okay, Robert's correcting me, 65. And from that point on, he had him on all the time. And then, of course, you had Joey Bishop had a short-lived talk show on ABC for a while. They had Mike Douglas, Merv Griffin, Dinah Shore came along, Dick Cavett. Later on, Bob Costas had his interview show later. They all loved having Don on, and he would come on, and he was such a great guest because he would just keep everybody in stitches, and just be so quick on his feet or on his tush, because he was sitting down most of the time. But and just making and the audience loved it. Believe me, I cover television. If he was on these shows and it wasn't resonating, he would not be back on.
And he never plugged anything. I don't remember seeing anything where he's there to maybe plug a movie or a product or something. A lot of those folk went on the Tonight Show because they had something going on that they wanted to get to a broader audience. I don't ever remember him saying, hey, let me hawk this toothpaste, or hey, I'm going to be in this movie. He just walked on the stage or walked on the set, and for 10 to 15 minutes went at it and then left.
Yeah, that didn't happen very often. When Don's first attempt at we can call it a sitcom, they thought it was some kind of weird hybrid game show. It was called The Don Rickles Show in 1968. It was on ABC. Johnny Carson had Don on to talk about the show because Johnny's brother, Dick Carson, was Don's producer. So sort of Johnny was doing his brother a solid, even though it was on a different network. So they came out to talk about the show. Didn't help because the show bombed and it wasn't on very long. It was one of Don's, one of the several of the shows that just came and went very quickly. TV was no doubt the most important part of Don Rickles' career.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, our podcast with Michael Seth Starr. He's written several biographies. This case, we're talking about his latest one, Don Rickles, The Merchant of Venom. Let's chat for a few minutes, and then I want to get to Mr. Sinatra. Why do you think, kind of came through in your book a little bit, where Don was so extemporaneous that a script with lines that he had to memorize, that just seemed to be the complete opposite of who he was as a performer. Did that hurt his chances for success in a television show, a scripted show?
Absolutely. It was almost like sucking the life out of him, because you couldn't. Don had to be sort of seen and to be off the cuff as he could be. I mean, it was always a variation on the same theme, but it was always different. And when you're putting somebody literally into a box for 22 minutes for a sitcom, right? And he's the dad with the young kid and the beautiful wife, and he's coming home from work and he's in a bad mood, or he's the work, that wasn't Don Rickles, and it wasn't his shtick, and it didn't quite fit him. And yet he kept on doing it. He really wanted that sitcom. And we mentioned the Don Rickles Show in 1968. The second sitcom attempt was called the Don Rickles Show. This time it was on CBS, where he was married with a young daughter played by Erin Moran, who later went on to Happy Days stardom. Didn't work because he was the put upon husband coming home, dealing with it was typical sitcom fare for the early 1970s. The one that really did work to Don's benefit more than the others was CPO Sharkey.
And that lasted a couple of years, right?
It did, yes. It lasted 2 seasons in the mid-70s on NBC, 75 and 76, pretty sure. And the reason that worked, I think, was because they were writing to Don's strengths. Don was playing a Navy guy, right? Don was in the Navy for 2.5 years. He knew that world. He spoke that lingo. He was playing a chief petty officer named Otto Sharkey. He knew guys like this during World War II. He served with them. So that was, and he was making fun of all the guys in his unit. It was almost like, it would be going too far to say that it was almost like he was performing live and on stage, but that's as close as you were going to get to seeing Don performing on stage live, was him making fun of all his cohorts. Although it was scripted, a lot of it was not. And that was the beauty of Don. But that really was the closest that television, the sitcom genre, could get to the persona of Don Rickles to make it work in that format.
And if anybody who's listening has been in the military, you know that all we do is make fun of each other all the time. Your dad died. Hi, everyone starts laughing. It's unbelievable. If you're thin-skinned and you're in the military, you got to find another avocation, because that's not going to cut it. Let's talk about Frank Sinatra, please. It seems like an odd bromance, if I may use that term. Sinatra was famously proud and prickly, and Rickles just shattered all through that. Remarkably, I'd heard about it before, obviously, but reading it in more detail in your book, I did have to admit, as I turned the page, going, why didn't Sinatra just have this guy killed? Like, what was it about Rickles that made Sinatra enjoy it? Because I can only picture myself, or maybe you, at the Coconut Grove yelling insults at Sinatra and having us be taken to the alley, I mean, so to speak.
Right.
What was it about Rickles that Sinatra found so ballsy and funny?
I think you have to trace the origin of their relationship. I mentioned Don's mother before, Etta Rickles, who was a big influence in Don's career. Don's father passed away in the early 50s, when he was in his early 50s. So Don and his mother they were always close, but they grew closer when Don's father passed away.
And everyone loved her.
Everyone loved her.
She cooked for people. She cooked for all these celebrities.
Soup, chopped liver. She would come back. There's a story in the book Ernie Borgnine tells where he was doing The Odd Couple with Don in the 60s or early 70s, and she came back. He wasn't feeling well. She bought him soup and her famous chopped liver. They all loved her. So she was like the stage manager, right? But she was also friends in Miami Beach when she was living there with Frank's mother, Dolly Sinatra. So I think Frank put a lot of stock in that. And now she was friends with Dolly Sinatra. At this point, Don did not know Frank Sinatra. They did not travel in the same circles. However, Don was performing at a a smaller club in Miami Beach called Murray Franklin's. It was well known enough. It wasn't like you mentioned. It wasn't like the Copacabana in New York or the 21 Club or anything. But it was well known. It was a small club, Miami Beach, and Don was performing there, doing his insult act. And Etta Rickles, who knew Dolly Sinatra, really she asked for a favor. Can you please get Frank to go see she called him my sonny boy. Go see my sonny boy. He's really funny. Frank will enjoy it. Now, to Dolly's credit, she followed up, and Don was working there one night in 1959 at Murray Franklin's. He was doing his act. He didn't know that Frank was going to be there. Sinatra walks in. The veritable, the hush falls over the crowd. It's like, oh my God, Frank Sinatra's here.
The chairman of the board.
Yeah. What's going to happen? Oh, is somebody going to? Don, without missing a beat, looks over and he goes, "Go ahead, Frank. Make yourself at home. Hit somebody. I saw the Cannon in your last movie. The Cannon was a better actor than you are." All these insults and his looks and his acting ability. I saw. I love your voice. Too bad it's in Perry Como's body. All that kind of stuff. And he started it on Sinatra, and everybody's, the crowd's like holds his breath. Sinatra bursts out laughing. So everybody else is like, okay, great. Frank's laughing. We'll laugh. Everything is good. And from then on, Sinatra really enjoyed being in Don's company. He made Don an honorary member of the Rat Pack about a year later when they were filming Ocean's 11 at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. Frank, Peter Lawford, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop,
B.
Martin. And Frank Sinatra was famous. Everybody had a nickname. So he had, when the Rat Pack would hang out in their steam room at the Sands, they would wear bathrobes emblazoned with their nickname. Frank had one made for Don. It said Bullet Head across it, because that's what he called Don Bullet Head. He was losing his hair. That was Sinatra's, sense of humor. But Don loved it, and he loved being around these guys. And let's face it, it gave him a cachet in show business. If you were hanging around with the Rat Pack, you must be cool, right? If you can make fun of Frank Sinatra, you must be cool. If Frank can laugh at you, it's okay for us to laugh at you, even if you're making fun of Sinatra. So that really, really was a huge, huge boon to Don's career.
And it seems to be, for us here in 2023, especially anyone who's listening who's maybe, 15 to 20, 25 years younger than I am, I'm 55, is what a monstrous star Sinatra was from the 30s all the way for however many decades that he was pretty much always, he had some rough periods, obviously, but very close to the top of the people who were thought of as superstars in American entertainment.
Yes. And as you mentioned, Robert, he managed to keep that stardom in the firmament from, he had some low points, and then starting in the early 50s with From Here to Eternity, he won the Oscar, The Great Comeback. And he was, you said Frank, people didn't ask Frank who, they knew who you're talking about. Like Marilyn or, Elvis for that 20-year period. But Sinatra was just, it's hard. I think it really is hard for people of a certain age, younger people, to understand how big of a star he was. On par with, if you're talking about music, the Beatles, for instance.
Yeah, I was going to say Paul McCartney would be the only person I could think of. Yeah,
or just the Beatles as a whole in the scheme of rock music. They're always at the top. Maybe there are people like tiny bit below them, but yeah, Frank was a huge, huge star.
Michael Jackson would be another one at his peak, or Prince. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today is biographer Michael Seth Starr. We're discussing his latest book, Don Rickles, The Merchant of Venom. Previous biographies include Red Fox, Ringo Starr, Joey Bishop, William Shatner. I hope there were 20 chapters about him and George Takei, as opposed to anything else. You've been very gracious so far. We're about halfway through. One of the things that I find interesting about Don's movie career, he starts off kind of with, Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster. There's 2 Oscar winners right there. But one of the great what ifs of Don's career, and I've read this or watched it in several places, he was almost cast in the role of Al Czervik, played by Rodney Dangerfield in Caddyshack. I've read and I've seen Harold Ramis, the director, say we were really thinking Rickles, but then, Dangerfield was so popular in the late 70s, early 80s because of The Tonight Show. Did Don ever talk about getting that role, or was it even ever offered to him?
Yeah, you'd have to believe Harold Ramis. He's since passed away, but if he said that they were considering Don Rickles, and they were considering Don Rickles, he would have been, I think, custom made for that role.
Oh,
and he had the thing. And actually, the next book, the book I'm working on now, is a biography of Rodney Dangerfield. So I will talk about that.
Please come back on. He's my all-time, absolute all-time favorite. It's just simply hysterical.
But unlike Don knew the ins and outs of acting, and he had acted throughout the 60s. They might have been smaller roles, but he was in many, many movies. But some of them, Beach Blanket Bingo and How to Stuff a Wild Bikini, all these weird, Frankie Avalon and Ed Funicello stuff. But Don knew his way around a movie set. And from what I've read, Rodney Dangerfield, although he was great in the role, didn't really know how to act for the cameras, whereas Don did. So it would have been interesting to see. Rodney, of course, was, that's his role when it comes to movies.
Oh, how did he not win the Oscar? But your point's taken, Michael, because if you watch the documentaries of Caddyshack, you'll see, and we'll move on, but you'll see the other actors telling stories about how Rodney was like, no one's laughing, I'm bombing, I'm terrible, I'm not doing anything. And you had, whether it was Cindy Morgan or Chevy Chase going, no, they can't laugh. Like, you're stealing the movie, right, but they can't laugh. It ruins the soundtrack.
Yeah.
Toy Story. He is Mr. Potato Head. How did he get that role, and what did that mean to him for have his voice be listened to by basically a 21st century generation of people?
Right. John Lasseter, who created Toy Story, was a big fan of Don's, and when he was thinking of who would play Mr. Potato Head, Don Rickles came to him. And here you had sort of a movie for kids, obviously, and some for adults. There were some lines that would go over kids' heads, but Don was perfect for that because he could be like sort of the grouchy, sarcastic Mr. Potato Head, but in a way that was acceptable to children, and funny and grumpy and he got off some great lines. And Don did not want to do that movie. He was like, what do I want to do a kids movie for? With this weird animation, like, what am I going to do? So John Lasseter went to Don had a place in Malibu. He went to meet with him, and Don liked John Lasseter. John talked him into it. They paid Don a boatload of money. And the interesting thing is, so he did Toy Story, the original movie, and it was sort of a confluence of perfect events because Casino opened in 1995, and then Toy Story opened like 2 weeks later. So you had these 2 big movies opening, both that included Don Rickles. And that really gave his career, I wouldn't say his career was flagging at that point. He was there and treading water, but this really, again, put him back in the spotlight and really, I think, opened it up to a new generation of fans, including the talk show hosts I mentioned before, Jay Leno and Letterman, Conan O'Brien would all have Don on the show. Really, some do in part, especially for the younger talk show hosts, to Toy Story.
Let's go back to Johnny Carson for a while. Speaking of contemporaries not understanding how incredibly prestigious and powerful a certain person was, I mean, Johnny Carson was probably, without a doubt, the most famous person on television for decades. And there's a great friendship between Rickles and Carson where they really go after each other. It's really funny that Carson, who's known to have a really bad temper, he just allowed Rickles to destroy him on his own TV show, which just kind of shows you that's the unselfishness of Johnny Carson. But there was one particular incident I want to talk about, and that is ask you about, excuse me. And that is when Rickles walked on during Johnny Carson's Japanese massage and bath and started to run his mouth. And I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, I think he ended up, Johnny threw him into the tub, and they had like nature girls there. And yeah, they were wearing bathing suits. Don walked down, as you mentioned, started giving them lip, and Carson pushed them in. And that was one of the great moments and they used to show that all the time, actually, when they were shooting that. That moment with Don was great. And there was also another memorable moment, which people of a certain age might remember, when
here we
Don
go.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Don
had been on the Tonight Show, but Don's best friend in the world, Bob Newhart, was guest hosting for Johnny. Johnny was on vacation, one of his 84 weeks of vacation here. And so Don was on with guest host Bob Newhart. Don was telling a story, making a point, a joke, and he stamped Johnny's cigarette lighter down on the desk like he was stamping a passport. And it broke. And Newhart was like, "Oh, you're going to be in trouble when Johnny gets back." And Don, so they went on to the next thing. Well, little did Don know that, Carson heard about this, and they had pre-planned this whole thing where Johnny would come on the Tonight Show the next night, do his monologue, sit down at the desk, and he'd pick up the cigarette holder and go, "What happened? Who broke my cigarette holder?" And then somebody would say, "Yeah, it was
Doc Severinsen rats him out.
It was Rickles," but they had set this up. Don did not know about all this. Don, meanwhile, was taping CPO Sharkey, which was right across the hall from a Carson studio in Burbank at NBC. They were literally like 20 feet away, soundproof studios. So Johnny goes, "Rickles." So he takes a microphone, gets up from the desk. Cameras follow him as he walks out from the desk into the hallway, across the hallway, opens the door into where Don's in the middle of taping a scene with Harrison Page for CPO Sharkey. Johnny bursts the door open. He goes, "Rickles, what'd you do to my cigarette?" And I think for one of the only times Don was like speechless.
He was.
And then he started to laugh, he's like, "Oh," but he didn't know what to say because he had no idea. Everybody else, the guys in CPO Sharkey, knew this was going to happen. Carson, of course, knew. Don didn't. And it was one of those moments of late night television that's just it's indelible.
It's sweet revenge, but then Rickles takes it like he just is like, "Oh, I'm going to get it," and he laughs the whole way. And
yeah.
And I want to ask you about a third. You took my second one. Let me ask you about a third Tonight Show moment involving Don Rickles, where Don Rickles is the host, and that's the very famous October 1975 walk on the Tonight Show set, unannounced, of Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, and John Wayne. Yeah. It's incredibly beautiful to watch on YouTube. I don't remember it happening at the time, but you talk about three of the biggest stars ever just walked on the stage, and Rickles they didn't know Rickles was hosting, at least according to Bing Crosby. Go ahead. I was going to ask you, did Rickles ever talk about that? Because the look on his face is like he's like a little kid. And then he starts insulting people, and then he gets insulted right back by Bing Crosby, who says, "I was there to plug a book." And he goes, "I was hoping Mr. Carson, but I'll have to take what I can get." And the crowd all laughs at Rickles and everything. Did he ever talk about that incident? Or not incident, but occasion?
Don didn't really talk much about that at length. He mentioned it occasionally as one of his greatest highlights of his career. But you're right. And what an homage to Don that these guys, I mean, they said they didn't know he was hosting. They probably did. Mm-hmm. But that they would come on even if Johnny wasn't there. And probably weren't guaranteed the massive. Well, Johnny had a massive audience every night. I mean, and it might have fallen a little bit when he had many guest hosts, Don among them, and we mentioned Bob Newhart. Doc Severinsen would sit in occasionally, but yeah, I mean, what an homage to Don that these three giants would just and take his ribbing and give it back and just another classic late night moment, and there were so many of them with Don. That's definitely one of them.
Let me ask you to append to this. Why do you think these major league celebrities, and we're talking Oscar winners, Grammy winners, Emmys, Tonys, I mean, Hall of Fame entertainers in, let's just say, American cultural history, they didn't just enjoy laughing at Don's jokes when they saw him. They went specifically to club shows to get insulted by Don Rickles. That's a whole nother order of magnitude when it comes to being able to make fun of yourself. I mean, these guys are celebrities. They have big egos, but they seem to say, well, it's my turn. I want to go hear what he's got to say. I found that just phenomenal. I did not know that there were that many celebrities who would go to his shows knowing that they were going to get picked on, but that's why they went.
Yes, I think they wanted to show that for the most part they could laugh at themselves. And we mentioned, and again, it all goes back to Sinatra. If Don can make fun of Sinatra and he could laugh, then he can make, if I'm Ernest Borgnine and he makes fun of my looks, or, is that your wife or a moose? All that kind of stuff. I can laugh at myself too. And it was part of being, in the in crowd in show business. When Don was playing the Slate Brothers Club, which is big break in LA, and you had, everyday people, but also celebrities lining up around the block to get in 1959. There are many examples of that in the book. Huge stars, just Don would cherry pick, hey, I see, Shirley MacLaine's here, blah, blah, blah. I see, Errol Flynn is here, whoever it was. I mentioned Borgnine was one of his favorites. He was like low hanging fruit for Don, but they were friends, and at least these celebrities in public would laugh. Not everybody was a huge fan. I know Groucho Marx early on was not a fan of Don's humor. Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz were not fans. Lucy came around a little later, and she had Don on one of her sitcoms in the 60s.
And she specifically requested him for her roast.
Yes.
It's amazing, these folks who got roasted, Sammy Davis Jr. and others, like when Dean Martin is putting together the lineup, right? They'd say, we need Rickles here. Like, Rickles has to come to this.
Yeah, Red Fox too. I think he was the Red Fox roast. But so I think it was part of the celebrity world of seen and being seen and showing that they had, celebrities, they're just like us. We can laugh at ourselves. That not all of them were real. They might have been laughing on the outside. They were probably dying on the inside, but they wanted to be part of this hot act. And that carried over into, it wasn't that, it was really when Don was doing his club work in LA and New York. I would say when Don segued and he became huge in Las Vegas, he spent I think it was 12 years as the main guy at the Sahara Hotel. Those audiences there would occasionally be celebrities, but listen, you're in Vegas, somebody's going to stop by to see your show. It's just the way it was. But for the most part, that was just everyday people, tourists, people who were gambling would come in and just want to be insulted by Don, or better yet, watching someone else get insulted by Don. And the guys the guys who were staging these shows at these venues like the Sahara and the Golden Nugget and all these the Sands Hotel, they knew they would sort of cherry pick people and put them in the within Don's eyesight in the first. They had sort of a prearranged agreement, Mm-hmm. So if Don looked down into the third row or the second row, saw somebody, he could make fun of what they were wearing or their mm-hmm. looks or their ethnicity, their wife, their husband. It was that was his act, and people expected that and they loved it. Probably more so if they weren't the ones getting picked on. But I think even the people, people always said it was sort of like a badge of honor to be picked on by Don Rickles. And listen, these people were coming from all over the country to see a show in Vegas. How great is it for the world's greatest the insult comedian to single you out? And then Don had this great talent of he'd single Robert out. He'd go on to other people. in the audience, and then a half hour later come back and remember your name and say, "Hey, is that funny, Robert? You laugh." And he had this great memory of and it would make people feel like they were part of this experience. And I think that was part of the magic of his act.
And if you watch some of the American Film Institute tributes, right, it's clear that Rickles was specifically invited to insult the person who's receiving this honor. There's a great clip of him making fun of Julia Roberts at the Shirley MacLaine AFI celebration. Obviously, there's another one where he just destroys Martin Scorsese as his AFI celebration. But Rickles is making fun of Clint Eastwood and Jack Nicholson and everybody. So that generation wanted him to be a part of their celebrations. And I find that heartwarming, for lack of a better term.
Yes, and he knew most of them. I mean, he had worked with Shirley MacLaine in Vegas. He co-starred with Clint Eastwood in Kelly's Heroes in 1969, one of Eastwood's first big movies. Of course, Scorsese. Marty, stand on a phone book so we can see what you look like. That all that De Niro, right? Stop mumbling and all that. And he knew these people personally, and they liked him, and that's what's important. If you're not well liked, you're only going to get so far making fun of somebody. And I think they knew it was Don's act. It was part of the shtick. He was a nice guy off. He was a nice. People knew that off stage he was just like a sweetheart, and it was the act. That's what he did for a living. And
I was watching. Forgive me. I was watching a Rich Eisen show. And they had, darn it, his name, Kevin Pollak, who does great impressionist, but actor. And they were talking about Casino. And Pollak said that De Niro, quote, worshipped Rickles. And Eisen's like, why? And Pollak's point was, De Niro said, when I was growing up, there were two groups. There were the doo-wop group and there was the put-down group. Like among kids, right? That's who they hung with.
Right.
And De Niro goes, I was a put down guy. So to have someone like Don Rickles making fun of me, putting me down all the time, that just takes me back to my childhood. And I loved it. Like his joke at the Scorsese thing where Rickles points to De Niro and goes, there's Bob De Niro, one of our country's greatest actors. You ask him.
Yeah. Yeah. And he would, it's mentioned in the book. There was when Don was filming Kelly's Heroes with Clint Eastwood. They filmed in Yugoslavia at that time it was called Yugoslavia, and in a small village, and they made sort of a promotional, like a local news crew came out and made a sort of a promotional behind the scenes making of Kelly's Heroes, featuring Don talking to the stars of the movie, and he was ripping on Eastwood for his wooden acting and mumbling, and you can't understand a word he says. And Eastwood loved it. It was great. That's on. I think you can find that on YouTube also. It's very interesting to watch.
One of the quote I remember reading decades ago, I think it was a story about Rickles actually, was when Ronald Reagan won the presidency, encounters Don Rickles and looks at, because they knew each other, obviously. Rickles famously destroys Ronald Reagan when he got roasted on the Dean Martin roast. Just brutal. Anyway, President Reagan looks at him and goes, come on, Don, insult me. And Rickles goes, I can't. You're the president of the United States. And I thought that was such a warm moment in its own way, because Reagan's like, I'm president of the United States, but I can still take it. I'm still Ronnie. And Rickles was like, no, I don't think that I can anymore. And then Sinatra puts him in that, was it the 1985 inaugural?
Yes.
Sinatra insists that Rickles goes there, and no one can tell or know what he's going to say. And the Reagan folks just let him go.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're right. His friendship, he knew Ronald Reagan from the 60s and the showbiz scene, and they'd see each other in restaurants. Reagan was a fan. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, because there are times I think where Don would not cross the line. One of them was he crossed many lines with Frank Sinatra, but there was one instance when Sinatra was married to Mia Farrow for those couple of years, however, in
weeks.
Yeah, right. And somebody once asked Don when he was, making fun of Sinatra at the time, why didn't you mention Mia? He's like, Mia Farrow. And Don said, there were certain, Frank's a friend of mine. There are certain lines. He basically said, there's certain lines I'm not going to cross. And he's going through a tough time in his personal life. That's not, that's nothing to joke about. And I think also to his benefit, he knew that if he pissed Sinatra off,
yeah,
it would not be good.
Well,
So, but he knew where to draw the line.
Let's talk about that, because one of the main things I wanted to make sure I got with you in our final few minutes here before we get to the 5 questions we ask all of our podcast guests is the line. The line started to move later in Don's career, clearly, and attitudes and what was acceptable started to change in terms of particularly ethnic humor or making fun of women. How did Don handle that and come back when he was toward the end of his life? He had some of the biggest popularity that he ever had. He survived that. You wrote in your book that he was grandfathered in, and I thought that was the perfect way to say it.
Yeah, and I really do believe that. I mean, Don came of age, and I'm not saying anything nobody knows or of that era. Came of age when humor and what was considered fair game was different. I'm not saying better or worse, but it was different. You could joke about ethnic groups more, or women, or his wife, jangling the jewelry, signaling the ships, and all that kind of stuff. That was one of Don's favorite lines. But that started to change. I think to Don's benefit, maybe it's the wrong word, but it started to change. But he was already so late in his career at that point that he was grandfathered in to an extent. Not everybody was thrilled. And he did sort of later in his career, in his 80s and from then on, cut back a little bit on that sort of thing. Because I think he knew the tenor of the times, and he was smart enough to realize that. But he didn't cut it out completely. And you mentioned before the American Film Institute tribute to Shirley MacLaine, which you mentioned before, Don. He was very funny. That was in 2012. Barack Obama was president, and Don made an Obama joke, something about, I told, Obama to come over, but he forgot to bring his mop, and he is in Hollywood, the liberal crowd, the gasp goes up. Oh my God. And then there's in the book, somebody who was there said, then within 30 seconds, Don had him back in the palm of his hand. He made his joke, didn't go over as well as maybe he thought, but then, but people were like, it's Don Rickles. Come on. What do you, of course he's going to say, if he's going to go there, he's going to go there.
Did you, have you ever seen, and I want to try to maybe end on this because I thought it was a sweet tribute in its own way. The clip on YouTube of the David Letterman show, or the Late Show, whatever the hell it's called, when Denzel Washington is the guest. Have you seen this?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with that one.
So Denzel, I'll send it to you. Denzel Washington is the guest. He's scheduled to leave, but he stays on the set because Rickles is next. And he gives Rickles this huge ovation and gives him a hug. And I think at one point, Rickles was mostly making fun of Letterman, right? Because he really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
But he looks over at Letterman one time and goes, "Why is this guy sitting here? Does he have to clean up?" Pointing to Denzel Washington. And the crowd kind of doesn't laugh, and it kind of laughs. And Denzel Washington dies laughing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you just think that's a Gen X attitude. And I thought it was sweet for Denzel to pay tribute to Rickles, not knowing what he's going to say, knowing of what he has a history of saying, but Denzel like giving off the vibe of, we all got to laugh. And sometimes we got to laugh at ourselves.
Yeah. And I think performers, you mentioned Denzel Washington, they knew Don wasn't racist, yes, given the tenor of the times in the 60s and the 50s, his jokes seen through that prism now would not play well. I think some of them wouldn't. But that's just the way it was in those days. I mean, it sounds corny to say, but you could joke about that sort of thing, and people who knew Don and knew him off stage knew that he was not a hateful man. He made fun of his get out of jail free card was he made fun of everybody, every ethnic group, including Don was Jewish, including Jewish people, and nobody was off limits with him. What they say, equal opportunity offender, right?
but very sort of East Coast in its own way.
Yeah, that New York, that very New Yorky attitude. But I do think that, and people have asked me this before, and I do think that had Don been coming up in 2023 as a young comic, no, he would be canceled. I just don't see how it could work.
But I also see Don looking at someone like Dave Chappelle and going, "Oh my God, is he funny?"
Yeah. He loved comics too. I mean, it was never personal with Don, and I think some people who knew Don knew that it didn't. And it's mentioned in the book. Not everybody was. That's not to say everybody who loved Don Rickles was a fan of his, and he had a lot of detractors out there. And a lot of people didn't think he was funny. And listen, I mean, people, it's you're an actor. Some people are going to think you're a good actor. You're not a good actor. Some people are going to like my book, The Merchant of Venom. Some people aren't going to like it. It's just that's the way it is. That's what makes the world go around, right? You can't, no accounting for taste, I guess.
Plus, he was an influence on so many young comedians, like Rodney Dangerfield was. It's Howard Stern, Tim Allen, Jerry Seinfeld. I mean, the list goes on. Tina Fey. The list goes on and on. We have reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Starr, are you ready?
I'm ready as I'll ever be.
What was your first job?
We talking like in high school? I worked at a fast food place in high school.
Which one?
It was a fast food place called Buffalo Bob's in a mall in Paramus, New Jersey, which is where I grew up.
My family's from Camden, at least the paternal side. What was your first concert?
Electric Light Orchestra, 1977. 1976, maybe, at Madison Square Garden.
Now, they were big, to say the least.
At that point, yeah.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh, boy. I prefer biographies. So, I mean, I'm reading a really good one right now. It's a biography of J. Edgar Hoover called G-Man.
Mm-hmm.
I just thinking of it because I'm reading it now. It's very good. If you're a music fan, there was a biography of called Dear Boy, The Life and Times of Keith Moon, the drummer for The Who, which is probably my all-time favorite rock and roll book.
And I just found out this week, we're taping this the week of January 23rd, that Keith Moon and Mama Cass died in the same bed 4 years apart.
They did, in Ringo Starr's apartment. He wasn't living there at the time. But yes, it's a very sinister, fabled history in London.
I guess it's not like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both dying on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, but in its rock and roll way, it kind of is.
Yes.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I might being in the audience at the Ed Sullivan Theater in February of 1964 when the Beatles performed. It's an indelible moment. And
February 9th, I think, is when
February 9th, 1964. And just seeing them. And then because now obviously we know how big they got after that, but that would have been interesting.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record to talk about anything you want, whom would you choose?
Do they have to be living or do they have to be
living?
I don't know. It's a good question.
It's an attempt to make the question easier, actually.
Yeah. I don't
know that's worked out that way.
No, I off the top of my head, I don't know if there's anybody that really would, need to talk to for 2 hours. But
Paul McCartney.
Yeah, but the thing about Paul McCartney is he's been interviewed so many times now. What's left to say? I mean, I can't imagine. I would have liked to have sat down with Ringo Starr. I wrote a book about Ringo, biography of Ringo Starr. I would have loved to have talked to him. He wasn't having it. But just to hear about his more, not so much about the Beatles, but about his early life in Liverpool, because that fascinated me when I was writing the book. But I'm gonna be the one person who says, you know what? I can't think of a name off the top of my head.
A lot of people have said, a lot of people just say they say their wives or husbands because they can't think of anyone.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to go there too, but I sit with my wife for 2 hours.
We're getting close. Okay. We're getting close to Valentine's Day, Mr. Starr.
That's
so
right.
Are you sure?
That's right.
You have been listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast, sponsored by Indiana-based public relations enterprise, Veteran Strategies, Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. As always, all of our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been Michael Seth Starr, author of The Merchant of Venom, Don Rickles' biography. It's a terrific book. You'll learn a lot about what is really a nostalgic, we said golden age, but beautiful period in American cultural and entertainment history. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Michael, I hope you come on again and we can talk about another one of your books, especially the one on Rodney, because he's my favorite.
Yeah, I would love to do that. And thank you for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.